Hey everyone, CoolKid here. Warframe contains a truly bewildering amount of stuff. 65 playable Warframes, hundreds of weapons in each slot, loads of unique mods and arcanes, and so much more. This game's sandbox is absolutely massive, with virtually endless combinations of items and effects. All of this stuff, of course, needs to be balanced in some capacity, so as to keep individual options competitive. The thing is, with such an absurd quantity of items, some things are bound to be more poorly balanced than others. So, in today's video, I want to talk about various cases of bizarre balancing decisions made by DE. This video isn't going to focus on power levels so much as design choices. I'm not trying to say that the subjects of this video are necessarily strong or weak. I also want to be clear that I'm not trying to say that the whole game is poorly balanced, or that the developers are incompetent. Rather, I want to discuss individual examples of design decisions that just confuse me. With all that said, let's get into it. During TennoCon 2023, players who watched non-main stage panels for 30 minutes were graced with the Gotva Prime. This assault rifle's stats are pretty good up front, with a solid fire rate of 13.3, a large 84-round magazine, half a meter of punch-through, 23% crit chance, a 2.5 times crit multiplier, 27% status chance, and 25 puncture damage. What really makes Gotva interesting, though, is its gimmick, where shots that inflict a status effect have a 15% chance to grant the next shot a fixed 300% crit chance. Note that this effect is rolled separately for each hit of multi-shot, and as the crit chance is fixed, you can have your crit lowered if it's over 300%. Even so, this gimmick is really good, and it opens up several new ways to build the weapon. Because Gotva has solid crit stats, you can build it as a hybrid weapon with the occasional bump in crit chance. Or, if you'd prefer, you can go all in on the gimmick, focusing entirely on status chance to maximize the red crit count. Fast forward to the old piece in late 2025, and players were given two new weapons to complete the Orokin-era Grineer set, the Sagek Prime and the Galariac Prime. The Sagek is an auto pistol, and it has pretty similar stats to the Gotva: slightly lower fire rate at 12.3, slightly lower mag size at 75, higher crit chance at 30%, lower crit multiplier of 2.2 times, and a status chance of... what the fuck? Well, it's got 26 base damage, with said damage being split between slash, puncture, and impact. If we look at Sagek's modding screen, we can find why its status chance is so abysmal. Its unique gimmick is essentially the opposite of Gotva's. When inflicting a crit, the next shot has a 6% chance to apply 5 status effects, or in other words, the next shot has a flat 500% status chance. Note that, like Gotva, this bonus is rolled separately for each hit of multi-shot. So Sagek is basically Gotva but backwards, except you might have noticed one teeny tiny difference. The Gotva has a usable crit chance, but Sagek's status chance is completely unworkable. This means that, while Gotva can rely on its solid base stats and use its gimmick for periodic boosts in damage, Sagek is entirely reliant on its gimmick to inflict status effects. Because status procs are often a major source of utility and damage, this makes Sagek feel very inconsistent, as it has almost no way to score procs without its gimmick. If you're unlucky, you can eat through all of an enemy's health bar with no status effects, which just feels rough. In effect, Sagek just feels like a regular crit-focused machine pistol with exceptionally inconsistent status, as opposed to Gotva being a solid hybrid rifle with a cool X-factor. It's also worth noting that individual hits of multi-shot can have over 100% status chance, meaning that they can inflict more than one status effect at a time. In Gotva's case, this means that individual bullets can roll for the gimmick's crit boost multiple times. For Sagek, though, orange and red crits are treated the same as regular crits by the gimmick, so any tier of crit will only roll for the bonus once. This means that the only way to boost the gimmick's odds, outside of 100% crit chance, is multi-shot. Sagek also has a mere 6% chance to trigger its gimmick, compared to Gotva's 15%. So not only is Gotva's gimmick much more likely to trigger because of shots exceeding 100% status chance, but it also has a 2.5 times higher chance to trigger at all. On top of that, it still has solid hybrid stats to work with if the gimmick doesn't trigger. Sagek, though, it's entirely reliant on its gimmick for status effects, and that gimmick is much less reliable than Gotva's. To be fair, I think it's important to acknowledge some nuance I've thus far ignored. Crit and status are not the same thing. It makes sense for Gotva's buff to be easier to access than Sagek's, as a single red crit is much less valuable than 5 status effects. Gotva's damage boost applies to one hit of multi-shot, while Sagek's boost lasts for several seconds and affects all subsequent shots. Pistols also generally have better multi-shot mods than primaries, so the lower activation chance is offset somewhat by the higher bullet quantity. Sagek can also dilute its status pool by running multiple different damage types, meaning that individual effects will roll low stat counts. In the same vein, narrowing the number of damage types can cause Sagek to reach 10 stacks of specific status effects fairly quickly. My issue here isn't that Sagek's gimmick isn't the exact same as Gotva's, but rather that Sagek crutches on its gimmick way harder than Gotva does. Now, I want to make it clear that Sagek is not so bad that it's unusable. If you like Sagek, or you found ways to make it work, more power to you. The thing I want to highlight is that Gotva's gimmick was added on top of an already solid foundation, while Sagek was kneecapped to make room for its gimmick instead. While Gotva's gimmick opened up cool new ways to build an already solid weapon, Sagek's just offloaded its status chance to critical hits entirely, and it doesn't even do that particularly well. Sagek's unique mechanic has a lot of potential, but in practice, it just feels like a crit auto pistol with a really inconsistent status chance. If this weapon had a more workable status chance, like say 15%, it would feel like a much more complete weapon. You could make other improvements too, like making crit tiers above yellow roll the bonus multiple times, or increasing the base chance for the gimmick to activate. Really though, all this weapon needs is a status chance that's at least usable. That way, Sagek won't be entirely reliant on its gimmick for status effects, but instead, the gimmick will be a big burst of status from time to time, just like how Gotva's gimmick handles crit. Again, I do not think that Sagek is an unusably bad weapon, but I do think that its stats were gutted to fit its gimmick, which turned it from a cool concept into a mediocre machine pistol. While there are other weapons that follow this design philosophy of crippling a weapon's stats to make room for a gimmick, Sagek is such an egregious example that I've dubbed the entire phenomenon Sagek Syndrome. If that's not enough proof for you though, let's look at another case. Enceladus. This weapon was released with the Shadowgrapher update, serving as Foley's signature weapon. This beam rifle has an alt-fire that douses enemies in ink, and if an enemy drops below 35% HP, they will be executed by the next instance of damage that Enceladus deals to them. This is a really cool gimmick if you ask me, and it opens up some cool ways to use the weapon. Unfortunately, as compensation for this gimmick's existence, Enceladus doesn't have any chaining and deals pretty low damage when compared to other beams. On top of that, if an enemy isn't inked, its time to kill is terrible, meaning that you basically have to use the gimmick for it to function. Don't get me wrong, Enceladus is not nearly as kneecapped as Sagek, and you can make it do some cool stuff. I bring it up to show that Sagek Syndrome is not exclusive to Sagek, it's just the strongest example of it. Oh, you might have noticed that I never talked about Galariac Prime, and that's because its gimmick is fine. It has a flat 10% crit chance added for each unique status effect on the target, which is pretty cool. It does have a low base crit chance at 19%, but that's not nearly as bad as Sagek's 1% status chance, and melees have a lot of ways to boost their crit chance. Honestly, Galariac's biggest problem is that it's a scythe, which means that it's competing with the final boss of heavy attack weapons, Harmony. With the 2018 release of Shrine of the Eidolon, a dozen Warframes were given various buffs to make them more competitive. Of this lineup, Atlas received some of the most extensive changes, including the addition of a new passive, Rubble. This mechanic revolves around a unique pickup exclusive to Atlas, the Rock. These Rubble pickups are spawned in two ways, when a petrified enemy is killed by Atlas, or when one of Atlas's Rumblers dies. When collecting a Rubble pickup, Atlas is granted a variable amount of bonus armor. It's normally 50, but petrified enemies killed by Landslide grant 75 armor, and the armor granted by a Rumbler's death decreases as it loses health. Regardless, when a piece of Rubble is collected, it contributes its corresponding armor quantity to the Rubble gauge. This gauge caps out at 1500 bonus armor, and while that is a big jump in tankiness, it's not exactly permanent. You see, if Atlas has gone more than 2 seconds without collecting a piece of Rubble, then his Rubble gauge will decay at a rate of 5 armor per second. This is doubled to 10 armor per second if he's inside a nullifier bubble, because of course it is. Considering this decay mechanic, Atlas is incentivized to generate and collect Rubble constantly so as to maintain the maximum armor bonus. This is especially important when using Rubble Heap, a very powerful augment mod that buffs Atlas's first ability. While the Rubble gauge is at or above 1400 armor, Landslide costs no energy, travels twice as fast, targets enemies up to 24 meters away instead of 12 meters, and deals 100% more damage, additive with power strength. So that's all well and good. Petrify and punch enemies, or eat your rumblers to stay topped up on tankiness and buff your fisticuffs. That all tracks on paper, but there's one tiny detail I didn't mention about Rubble earlier. It grants you armor, or it heals you for the same amount in HP. Notice I said or, as in, it does not grant armor if you heal by picking up a piece of Rubble. Even worse, if a piece of Rubble heals Atlas, then it does not stop the Rubble gauge from decaying. When restoring armor, picking up a piece of Rubble stops the gauge's decay for 2 seconds, but this is not the case if you heal. If that wasn't bad enough, missing any amount of health causes this to happen. Even if you're only missing 1 HP, picking up Rubble will not grant any armor, and the Rubble gauge's armor decay will not be paused either. The reason I bring all this up is probably pretty obvious, but for those who haven't pieced it together, healing with Rubble actively hurts your ability to maintain your Rubble, meaning that this passive has a built-in anti-synergy. To explain what I mean, let's ask a question. What is the simplest benefit of having armor? Well, to grant damage reduction to your health. But on Atlas, taking damage to your health will prevent you from gaining further armor through Rubble. As such, you are actively encouraged to not take damage to your health in order to maintain Rubble's armor. But if you aren't taking damage to your health, then your armor isn't really doing anything for you, is it? The point of having high armor is to make your health tankier, but if you actually try to take advantage of Rubble's armor, then you'll lose said armor by healing on subsequent Rubble pickups. This is even worse if Atlas is using Rubble Heap, as not only is he losing his EHP bonus, but he also eventually loses access to all of the benefits that Rubble Heap provides. Now, with all that said, I do want to play a bit of devil's advocate here. I think it's worth noting that Landslide makes Atlas invincible during its cast animation, meaning that he can safely heal without taking additional damage. This does give him a chance to recover health and start gaining armor again, but it has several issues. For one, Rubble's heal is very small, and Atlas has a pretty large health pool, so healing through Rubble alone takes a lot of kills. For two, if Atlas is invincible, then he's still not benefiting from the bonus armor. Atlas can also offset this anti-synergy with external healing tools, such as Gloom, Arcane Reaper, Vazarin, and so on. This helps him heal much faster than through Rubble alone, meaning that he can start restoring his armor much sooner. Thing is, this still isn't part of Atlas's base kit, so it just puts a band-aid over the actual problem. I'm gonna be honest, I find this passive's idiosyncrasies extremely confusing. If Atlas healed and gained armor when collecting Rubble, or at the very least his decay timer paused when healing, then his passive would be perfectly fine. As it stands though, Rubble has a built-in anti-synergy that punishes you for trying to actually benefit from it. Armor makes your health tankier, but health damage loses your armor, making you more fragile. It's a really bizarre loop that's always left me scratching my head. Atlas is by no means a bad Warframe, even if half of his kit kinda sucks, and Rubble isn't necessarily terrible either. This passive just requires outside help to function when it should be fairly insular, which I think is really odd. In late 2025, Warframe received one of its wackiest updates, the Vallis Undermind. This update added Arc Gun Arcane adapters, a wide array of mushrooms, the Chudling, and a freshly reworked Oberon. Oberon's rework was a highlight of the update for me, as I've always really liked his paladin playstyle, but prior to Undermind, he was pretty underwhelming. Sure, he did support his allies, but he was clunky to play and lackluster in his role. Noko's update changed that though, and it did so by overhauling every single one of Oberon's abilities. Smite was changed to full strip enemy defenses, and on top of that, 75% of the enemy's maximum health would be taken and dealt to nearby enemies as damage. This turned Smite from a really awkward source of scaling damage into an anti-Eximus button, which gave it a much more defined role in the kit. Oberon's Hallowed Ground was changed from a wedge into a circle, making it cover much more area on each cast. On top of that, the carpet went from a 15% radiation status chance to a 100% radiation status chance, making it much better for crowd control. The circular cast makes this crowd control easier to spread throughout rooms, and the status immunity already provided by Oberon's carpet became much easier to maintain. This ability also previously provided bonus armor when used in combination with Renewal, but that was changed to double Renewal's healing instead. Speaking of Renewal, this ability got a huge glow up with Oberon's rework. The ability was changed to have a fixed energy drain, where it previously drained more energy for each ally that was being healed. It was also made to grant up to 100% more armor to the casting Oberon, which is multiplicative after mods, and it grants double Oberon's armor to allies within its radius. On top of all of that, Renewal had its casting behavior changed to grant the buff to allies within Oberon's affinity range, so it became much less annoying to actually give your teammates the buff. Oberon's fourth ability, Reckoning, also got a lot of great changes. It now grants up to 1000 bonus armor for Oberon based on the number of enemies hit, making him even tankier. It also strips up to 100% of enemy armor, which it did do before, but affected enemies no longer need to be standing on hallowed ground for this strip to work. The last change I want to highlight is that enemies hit by Reckoning have a 50% chance to drop a health orb on death, regardless of whether or not Reckoning itself killed them. So that's all great stuff, right? Oberon leans much more into his Paladin theme after his rework, having strong debuff and damage options alongside excellent supportive tools. His emphasis on armor and HP regen make him a fantastic tank in his own right, and his status immunity is pretty easy to use. Really, it's refreshing to have a DR and regen focused tank who's actually really good at their job. Oh, what? I forgot his passive? Right, let's... Oh, god damn it. So, as you might have guessed, this is where things go wrong. Oberon's rework granted him a brand new passive, which works like this. When Oberon picks up a health orb, he and allies within affinity range are granted a stack of the Righteous Negation buff. This causes little shields to orbit those affected, and the buff stacks up to 3 times. So long as a Tenno has any stacks of this buff, they are completely invincible and immune to status effects. If damage is taken while any stacks of Righteous Negation are present, then a stack of the buff is consumed, with there being a 0.25 second grace period between stack consumptions. If the player's final stack of the buff is consumed, they are made invincible for 0.5 seconds, so they basically get twice the invincibility duration. Now, this ability seems kinda modest on paper. Yeah, it's invincibility, but it's got a short duration and requires health orbs to activate. That's true, but there's one small detail that changes things. Oberon's Reckoning generates a shit ton of health orbs. This allows Oberon to produce and collect health orbs very frequently, especially in high enemy density content. This gets even more absurd with Arcane Universal Fallout, as both Hallowed Ground and Reckoning inflict the radiation status. This lets enemies drop Universal Orbs, which also trigger the Righteous Negation buff. You can even get your companion involved with Synth Deconstruct, producing even more health orbs to turn into Righteous Negation charges. I'm gonna be honest, I think this passive was straight up a mistake. In a weird way, this passive is so good that it makes several other abilities redundant. As long as Righteous Negation is active, Renewal just isn't useful, as its healing and armor bonus don't do anything if you're invincible. Hallowed Ground also loses a lot of its value when the passive is in play, as its status immunity and double healing both don't matter either. So long as Oberon's got at least one charge of his passive, his second ability loses half of its usefulness, and his third ability loses all of its usefulness. Because Righteous Negation also applies to allies, his teammates also gain no value from his other support abilities so long as he can maintain the passive. With Righteous Negation in play, Oberon goes from an armor and regen focused tank to an invincibility generator, making a huge part of his identity moot. It's not even like you can just ignore this mechanic if you don't like it, as it's literally Oberon's passive. You're going to collect health orbs from time to time. That's just part of playing the game, so Righteous Negation is inevitable. This is especially the case if you're using Universal Fallout or casting Reckoning, which both have value outside of their orb generation. Now, I don't think the fundamental idea behind this passive is bad. Oberon has a lot of healing in his kit already, so giving him a new way to interact with health orbs is pretty cool. This invincibility does also require a more active playstyle than, say, Revenant, but it's still very easy to maintain at Steel Path levels. Personally, I'd just change the buff to something else, like 75% DR or something. I know that's not nearly as good as passive invincibility, but it's a passive, so I don't think it needs to be anything earth-shattering. At the very least, I'd like the passive to not overshadow Oberon's other abilities. We live in a world where people drop Renewal because his passive makes it useless, and I think that makes this a pretty dark timeline. Fortuna was one of Warframe's biggest updates, and its sequel update was no slouch either. Fortuna Part 2, known more officially as the Prophet Taker update, added a lot of stuff to the game. Chief among its additions was Baruch, a Warframe themed around pacifism and patience. Right up until you piss him off. I've always found it really funny that Baruch has such insane damage potential considering his theme as a monk, but that's how these things shake out in Warframe. Also, fun fact, Baruch has a combo in the Desert Wind stance called Father's Lesson, meaning that he canonically beats his children. So, Baruch is a Warframe who revolves around his Restraint meter. Somewhat confusingly, this meter starts filled, and it grants bonuses for removing it. Casting Baruch's other abilities depletes this meter, granting up to 50% damage reduction when empty. More importantly, Baruch's exalted sparring weapon, Desert Wind, draws from this resource instead of energy. While active, Baruch regenerates Restraint to fuel his exalted, with the ability being dispelled once his Restraint is fully restored. As such, Baruch's gameplay loop revolves around keeping his Restraint low, both to maximize his passive damage reduction and to permit access to his child beaters. So, how exactly do you reduce Baruch's Restraint? Well, the most common method is Lull, which spawns a 25-meter zone around Baruch. This zone lasts for 5 seconds, and enemies that come into contact with the zone are put to sleep for 20 seconds while eroding the Restraint meter by 0.8%. With even just decent range, this ability can take huge chunks off the Restraint meter, but it does have a problem. Enemies put to sleep by Lull cannot reduce Restraint again until they wake up. This means that low duration setups are actually quite good on Baruch, as enemies will wake up faster, meaning that they can be used to reduce Restraint again. Baruch's third ability, Desolate Hands, is also able to reduce Restraint, though that's not really its main purpose. On cast, this ability spawns 8 daggers around Baruch, with the dagger count scaling with strength. If any enemies are present within 6 meters, these daggers will launch towards them at a rate of 1 enemy per second. If an enemy is struck by a dagger, their weapon is destroyed, disarming them and dealing 250 blast damage in a 3-meter radius. When a dagger strikes an enemy, the Restraint meter is eroded by 1.6%, but because of the 1 second delay between disarms, it's not super fast. The disarm isn't all this ability is good for, though, as each dagger orbiting Baruch provides 10% damage reduction, up to a cap of 90%. This 90% DR stacks multiplicatively with things like Adaptation, Baruch's 50% Restraint DR, and the 40% DR he receives while using Desert Wind, making him extremely tanky. In a weird way, the daggers disarming enemies can actually be a bad thing, as it can cause the ability to drop below 90% DR. Fortunately, because the dagger count scales with strength, it's easy to have a lot of extra daggers as a layer of redundancy. So that's all well and good, but you might have noticed that I skipped over Baruch's first ability, Elude. As you probably guessed, that's because it's the problem child of this section. To explain what I mean, let's first establish how Elude actually works. On cast, Baruch will assume a unique stance, causing all attacks within a 180-degree angle to pass through him. Do note that this angle is based on where Baruch himself is facing, not where the player's camera is looking. Each time a projectile or melee attack passes through Baruch, the Restraint meter is eroded by 1.2%, making this a very fast method of removing Restraint. This ability comes with a few major caveats, though. For one, Baruch can only dodge attacks while he himself is not attacking, and if he does attack, there's a 0.2 second reactivation delay once he stops. This ability also drains 2.5 energy per second, which is a much bigger deal than you might think. Because Serene Storm uses Restraint instead of energy, efficiency doesn't really matter that much on Baruch. His other abilities are cast infrequently enough that he only needs periodic energy gain to maintain his kit, and that energy can be gained from a variety of sources. If Baruch plays into Elude, however, then he's much more limited in that regard. Not only does he have to care about efficiency and duration, 2 stats he can normally ignore, but he also won't be able to gain energy from a bunch of stuff, like Xenarix Wellspring or energy pizzas. I also want to go back to the 180-degree dodge angle for a second. This angle does scale with range, meaning that Baruch can have a full 360-degree dodge angle at 200% range. This allows Baruch to dodge attacks from any angle, making him much better at surviving wayward shots from off-screen enemies. Thing is, this has the same issue that the channeled element has. Baruch doesn't normally need this much range. Even worse, reaching that 200% range breakpoint requires the use of Overextended, which knocks off 60% power strength. Strength is a very useful stat for Baruch, as it massively benefits both Desolate Hands and Desert Wind. While I don't think Baruch should freely dump range, as it is still useful on him, he doesn't normally need this much, and it comes at the detriment of his 3 and 4. If you decide to not take Overextended and just do 190% range, that's still 3 mod slots of investment, which is pretty steep. So that's all pretty rough, but it isn't even the main problem. My issue with Elude is that it at best does very little for Baruch, and at worst it is actively harmful to him. Let me explain. So let's look at Baruch's 2 again. If enemies are put to sleep, they aren't attacking Baruch, which means that Elude isn't doing anything. More importantly, this means that Elude isn't reducing restraint, which is one of its best attributes. If you build into high range for Elude, then you're also increasing the range of Lull, which means more enemies are put to sleep, which means that less enemies are shooting at Baruch, which means that less restraint is being eroded. But what if you just build into negative duration so sleeping enemies wake up faster? Well, you could do that, but then you'd be massively increasing the channeling cost of Elude, so it's not really viable. The disarm from Desolate Hands is in a similar spot, as enemies without guns erode much less restraint for Elude. Not only do enemies swing their melees much slower than they shoot Baruch with their guns, but they also have to physically approach Baruch to attack him, massively lowering restraint loss. On top of that, Elude actually doubles the dagger's disarm range while active, meaning that it is actively sabotaging itself if both abilities are active at the same time. Combine that with the fact that building into range for Elude will also boost the seek range of Desolate Hands, and it's very hard to prevent the daggers from screwing you over. Even Desert Wind isn't safe from this anti-synergy mess, as it has a pretty obvious problem. If you're actively attacking with Desert Wind, then you aren't able to reduce restraint with Elude, as the ability won't be active. Even worse, you won't be protected by Elude, meaning that you can't really rely on it when using Desert Wind. Now, in fairness, you could just stop attacking and let enemies shoot you to reduce restraint. Because of the interactions with Baruch's other 2 abilities though, this would be a very slow process, as enemies who are asleep or disarmed aren't doing much for Elude. I also think it's important to highlight that Baruch is an absurdly tanky frame. This guy has 3 sources of damage reduction out of the box, making him pretty hard to kill. Elude's dodge does make him even harder to kill, sure, but at Steel Path levels, he doesn't really need it. Elude's survivability has a bunch of considerations attached, while tanking with Desolate Hands is pretty easy. As such, Elude's auto-dodge just doesn't really feel that needed, as he can soak up damage just fine in most content. Now, in fairness, there is a way to give Elude a more tangible benefit for Baruch: Elusive Retribution. This augment grants Baruch melee attack speed and critical damage for 6 seconds whenever an attack is dodged, and this buff stacks up to 6 times. The stack cap doesn't scale with any ability stats, but the buff duration scales with duration mods, and the attack speed and critical damage scale with strength mods. It's also worth noting that, if a stack is lost, you won't lose the whole buff. Rather, you go down a stack and the buff duration resets. This augment is pretty good on paper, but it's still hampered by all of Elude's other problems. Namely, your other abilities are still sabotaging Elude, which makes the buff difficult to maintain in my experience. The duration is short enough that you have to dodge attacks pretty frequently, but if enemies are asleep, disarmed, or dead, then Baruch isn't dodging shit. I think this is especially funny because Desert Wind is so powerful that I often lose the buff because there are no enemies alive to even attack me. Now, I want to make it clear that Elude absolutely can work if you play into it. The point I'm trying to make is that, if you want to play around Elude, you have to ignore most of Baruch's kit so it doesn't sabotage you. My issues with Elude can be summed up as such. It requires Baruch to build into stats he doesn't normally need, is actively sabotaged by his wider kit, and doesn't really provide him with a useful buff. Even with Elusive Retribution in play, the wider issues with this ability make it a chore to play around. Personally, I find myself only really using Elude to burn through restraint at the start of a mission. After that, I fire up my normal Baruch gameplay loop and never touch the ability again. The Old Blood update is infamous for many reasons, namely its release of Kuva Liches that insta-killed you for guessing wrong. This update also introduced Grendel, a warframe that people are totally normal about. On release, Grendel was a pretty weird frame from a design perspective. A lot of his kit didn't really do much for him, and while he did absolutely function, he didn't feel very cohesive. Fortunately, with the release of Lua's Prey, Grendel received a full-blown rework to address these issues. I know this rework is pretty divisive as it changed Grendel a lot, but personally, I think it made him a lot more fun to play. Grendel's entire kit has always revolved around his stomach, which post-rework can hold up to 5 enemies. Casting the rest of his abilities generally requires that an enemy be present in his stomach, and these enemies are dealt damage to cast said abilities. How do you get enemies in your stomach? Well, that's done with Grendel's first ability, Beast. This sucks up any dudes in front of Grendel, placing up to 5 of them in his belly. These enemies slowly take damage over time, and each enemy in Grendel's stomach grants him 250 bonus armor. So that's pretty simple. Grendel eats dudes with his one, and then he either digests them passively or consumes them actively to fuel his other abilities. This is demonstrated no better than with Regurgitate, Grendel's fourth ability. This spits out the oldest enemy in Grendel's stomach, turning them into a projectile that armor strips enemies and deals toxin damage. Even better, this ability deals scaling damage, as the hit deals 10% of the enemy's current health as damage too. Wait, did I read that right? 10% of their current health? Okay, this is where we start having problems. Because Regurgitate uses 10% of the enemy's current health instead of their total health, this ability's damage is wildly inconsistent. For one, enemies have often taken damage before Grendel eats them, be it from Grendel himself or his teammates. For two, all of Grendel's other abilities deal damage to the enemies in his stomach. Nourish deals 20% of the enemy's max health and shields as damage on cast. Pulverize damages enemies in Grendel's stomach both passively and when colliding with terrain, and the stomach itself deals damage via digestion. Not only that, but all of Grendel's abilities prioritize damaging the oldest enemy in the stomach. This means that casts of Regurgitate usually spit out the enemies that have taken the most damage. As a result, Grendel's entire kit is reducing the damage of his 4. If he doesn't suck up and immediately spit out a full health, high HP enemy, then the damage of his 4 is going to suffer, which is very backwards. If you've ever thought to yourself, wow, Regurgitate's damage feels really inconsistent, this is why. Honestly, I think the solution to this is pretty simple. Make Regurgitate deal a portion of the enemy's max health, not their current health. I also think Regurgitate should prioritize the highest HP enemy in Grendel's gut, just to make its damage feel more reliable. While I do quite like Grendel's rework overall, this one decision just baffles me. Now, this isn't directly related to Regurgitate, but I do want to talk about Grendel's passive real quick. This passive grants 250 armor per enemy currently in Grendel's stomach, but because he's going to be killing or vomiting up these enemies frequently, the armor bonus is rarely active. Grendel's whiter kit only functions if he's getting rid of the contents of his stomach, so his passive only has brief periods of presence. If stacks of his passive lingered for a short duration, like say 10 seconds, then I think it would be a lot more useful. I find it really weird that this frame's rework gave him 2 major points of anti-synergy, though I find Regurgitate's a lot more annoying, so it got the bulk of this section. With the release of Abyss of Dagath in 2023, Warframe finally received one of its longest requested reworks, Hydroid. This frame's overhaul made him much less stationary, instead leaning into the corrosive status effect. He still has strong crowd control like before, but his identity was expanded to removing enemy armor, on top of several other buffs. While Hydroid received many changes to his existing abilities with this patch, he also received one entirely new ability, Plunder. Plunder is, strangely enough, both simple and complicated. On cast, Hydroid steals the armor of all enemies within 25 meters, so long as they're on screen. Enemies hit by this ability take a stagger, and more importantly, any active corrosive procs are consumed, making their armor reduction permanent. On top of that, Hydroid gains a buff that grants him bonus armor and corrosive damage. This grants 40 armor and 10% corrosive damage per enemy hit, as well as an additional 40 armor and 10% corrosive damage per corrosive status consumed, up to a cap of 750 armor and 200% corrosive damage. These values all scale with strength, and the buff's base duration of 25 seconds scales with duration. Now, while the buff this ability provides is very good, its scaling requirements make it finicky. Because both enemy density and corrosive proc count matter, it's often the case that you'll receive vastly different buff values between casts, and the reason for the disparity usually isn't obvious. While Hydroid's abilities do inflict a lot of corrosive procs, which helps with reaching the maximum buff, armor-stripped enemies, die faster than armored ones? This means that enemies with corrosive procs often expire before you can even plunder their armor, especially if you have teammates or a high damage companion. Even worse, each cast of Plunder re-rolls the armor and damage bonuses, even if you already have the buff active. This is irritating enough by itself on account of the finicky setup, but it makes the rousing Plunder augment especially painful. This augment boosts the base maximum armor and damage bonuses by 50%, and on top of that, it heals Hydroid too. In specific, it heals 50 HP per enemy hit, and an additional 50 HP per corrosive proc consumed, scaling with strength. On paper, this sounds pretty good. It grants a higher buff and a new use for Plunder as a healing tool, which Hydroid sorely lacks otherwise. The problem, as you might expect, is the finicky nature of Plunder's buff. Not only do the buff requirements make reaching the higher maximum value difficult, but they also actively discourage using the ability to heal. If you recast Plunder to heal using this augment, there's a very good chance you'll roll a lower Plunder bonus than you had before. Not only does this hurt Hydroid's damage, but recasting into a lower Plunder value can lose a lot of armor, making him die much faster. As such, attempting to use this augment to heal can very easily result in a self-nerf, and sometimes it even results in death. Hydroid struggles to take advantage of Plunder's armor because he has no way to recover health, and while this augment lets him recover health, it's often to his detriment. Personally, I really think this ability should just keep your highest bonus if you recast Plunder while it's already active. This would make the ability a lot more comfortable to use, and on top of that, it would make rousing Plunder's heal actually beneficial. Airburst rounds on Zephyr already works this way with its secondary damage bonus, and it's very nice. For those who don't know, if Airburst round hits a higher number of enemies than its prior cast, then the buff refreshes and gets stronger. If it hits a lower number of enemies, however, it doesn't reroll the buff like Plunder does. Instead, it simply refreshes the duration of the buff, letting you keep your highest damage bonus. This is way more comfortable than Plunder's nonsense, and it would really benefit rousing Plunder if it worked like this too. While we're at it, maybe Furious Javelin could also get this treatment? I mean, that might be overpowered because it doesn't have a damage cap, but it would certainly feel a lot better to use. Not as needed as Plunder for sure, but I thought I'd mention it. Also, as one final footnote, I want to point out that Hydroid Prime has 370 base HP and 650 base shields at level 30. For a guy who has such a strong armor buff, why is his health stat so average? And why is his shield stat higher than his health? I don't know, man, this rework was weird. 2023 was an absolutely stacked year for Warframe, and it came out swinging with Citrine's Last Wish in February. This update, unsurprisingly, added Citrine, who finds herself in the all-too-rare support role. Being themed around gems and crystals, it makes sense that one of her abilities would also be used for crowd control. This fell to her ultimate, Crystalize, which spawns several crystalline Seekers on cast. These Seekers rush down enemies in front of Citrine and crystallize them, stunning them in place while spawning a large crystal growth. When shot, this growth sets the player's critical chance to 300%, forcing red crits to significantly boost damage. On top of that, the crystals are very large, making them much easier to hit than headshot. Wait, what? Yeah, so weirdly enough, the red crit from hitting a Crystallize growth actually deals less damage than hitting a yellow crit headshot, on most enemies at least. To explain why this is the case, I need to break open the math behind how crits work. I know this is kinda scary, but don't worry, it's all very simple, and we'll do an example to make it easier. So, to compare damages, let's use the AX-52. This weapon deals 40 puncture damage per shot, and it has a base crit multiplier of 2.4 times. For our target dummy, we'll be using an armor-stripped Butcher, as they have an easy-to-hit head and no relevant resistances or vulnerabilities. So, if we land a body shot crit, all we have to do is multiply the 40 base damage by the 2.4 times crit multiplier, giving us a total damage of 96. So that's pretty simple, but how does it work for crits above the normal yellow tier? Well, for higher tier crits, we have to use another formula to determine the critical multiplier. This formula is 1 plus the crit tier times the crit multiplier minus 1. For the crit tier portion of the formula, a yellow crit is tier 1, orange crits are tier 2, red crits are tier 3, and so on. So, with Crystallize forcing red crits, let's slot 3 into the crit tier portion of the formula. We'll slot in our 2.4 times crit multiplier as well, and as an important note, any crit damage mods would be in this section of the formula too. We aren't using any of that stuff though, so we'll just stick with 2.4. So, if we run the numbers, we get 208 damage, and if we check that in-game, we get 496? Our in-game damage would line up if this was a normal red crit, but Crystallize has one more weird consideration. For hit scan weapons specifically, the crit multiplier is multiplied by 2. So, if we go back to our formula and slot in the 2, we'll find our calculated damage lines up with the 496 we're getting in-game. Now, that's a lot of bonus damage, so why are we losing out to a yellow crit headshot? Well, to explain that, let's look at the regular crit formula again. In addition to these values, headshots yield a 3 times increase in damage on most enemies with most weapons. So let's go ahead and add a ×3 to the formula. This gives us 288 damage, and if we test it in-game, we'll see that's quite far off from the 576 damage we're inflicting. To explain this disparity, we have to consider one more mechanic. If a critical hit is also a headshot, another 2x multiplier is included in the formula. If we slot in this 2, we'll find our damage comes out to 576, which matches the values we're seeing in-game. All of this math is to prove a much simpler point. Headshots deal more damage than Crystalize growths so long as they're a yellow crit or better. Notice that I said or better, as in, orange and red crit headshots are considerably stronger than Crystalize growths, while yellow crits are only moderately better. It's also worth noting that, because Crystalize growths don't count as weak points, they can't trigger things like Galvanized Scope, and they don't benefit from buffs like Acuity mods. This means that, if the enemy has a head, the player has a weapon that can headshot, and the weapon can score a yellow crit, it's often much more useful to target the enemy's head. If the weapon has over 300% crit chance, then you'll definitely want to target the head, as Crystallize will set the crit chance to 300% exactly, meaning you'll lose out on damage. I do want to clarify that, while I think it's important to consider this information, I'm not trying to argue that Crystallize is bad. It still works very well on weapons with a low base critical chance, like the Phantasma or Stephalos. Crystallized growths are also able to grant their bonus damage to weapons that have no headshot multiplier, like the Alternox. Weapons without a headshot multiplier won't trigger the 3x headshot bonus or the 2x crit headshot bonus, so it's better to go for the growth in that case. Explosions also can't benefit from headshot bonuses, but they do benefit from Crystallize's red crit bonus if the projectile that spawned the explosion hit the growth. Beyond the weapons themselves, some enemies actually lack headshot bonuses altogether, like Chargers. Several Murmur enemies don't even have a head to begin with, regardless of any multipliers attached. Against these enemies, it is also generally better to go for the Crystal. Even if none of these factors are in play, Crystallize still paralyzes enemies it hits, which makes them easier to headshot. As such, Crystallize still provides value even in its worst use case. Now, the oddity I've highlighted in this section could be fixed by making the crystal growths count as headshots, but I don't really think that's necessary. Crystallize is still a very good ability overall, and it still has a lot of value with weapons that can't headshot. I certainly wouldn't complain if it was buffed, but unlike the other stuff I've talked about in this video, I don't really feel like it's needed. Okay, so I still have a bunch of stuff in my notes for this video, but none of the topics require nearly as much explanation as the things we've talked about so far. As such, this ending section is going to be a little lightning round of smaller balance oddities that bother me. Ivara's Concentrated Arrow Augment grants headshots a 50% flat increase in crit chance, but the explosion spawned by these headshots does not benefit from the crit chance bonus. The mod also adds 25% more base crit chance when the bow is fully charged, and that does benefit the explosion. Considering that explosions can't inherit headshot buffs normally, I genuinely wonder if this is a bug. Then again, this augment was reworked in May of 2025, and the headshot quirk didn't get changed, so maybe it's intentional? Either way, I think it's really odd and unintuitive. Titania's second ability, Tribute, has 4 different buffs that can be cycled and collected. One of these buffs is Entangle, which slows enemies within 35 meters by 25%. Unlike every other slow in the game, this buff only slows enemy movement speed, not fire rate or animation speed. Most slows in Warframe get a lot of their value from slowing these two things, as it makes enemies less threatening and easier to react to. I genuinely have no idea why this is the case, as the slow is only 25% and it isn't affected by any stat mods. This is easily the worst buff in Tribute's rotation, and that's saying something. Foley is a Warframe with a huge bag of tricks, largely stemming from her second ability, Shadowgrapher. This ability lets her spawn all sorts of constructs for all sorts of situations, but some situations are more common than others. If you need to kill things, which is most of the time, Foley is best served by her explosive barrels and arc traps. These both scale their damage with level, making them pack a huge punch. Foley's fourth ability, Plein Air, attaches enemies to balloons while stripping their defenses. This defense strip makes her damage abilities much more powerful, provided they can, actually reach the suspended enemies? Yeah, funnily enough, Foley's 4 actually carries enemies outside of the effective range of her barrels and traps, making them much less effective. I'm honestly really surprised this hasn't ever been changed, as all the devs would have to do is lower the height of plein air for it to work. Well, at the very least, jumping on the balloons refreshes your double jump, so I am not taking this ability off. Komei's first ability, Kumihimo, spawns a Weaver Star that rushes forward. In its wake, several Threads of Destiny are spawned, with each thread dealing damage and inflicting one elemental status effect. These threads only deal damage each time an enemy contacts the thread, so once an enemy touches a thread, they won't take further damage unless they step away from the thread and then back into it. This can be seen with certain ragdoll abilities, like Coil Horizon, which cause enemies to hit the threads multiple times. Under more normal circumstances, this ability is best for controlling hallways, as enemies will walk into them and take damage. Problem is, Komei's fourth ability, Bunraku, stops enemies from moving. This ability holds affected foes in place while inflicting them with up to 30 random status effects, and because these enemies are suspended, they can't move through Kumihimo's threads. This means that only the initial cast is useful, as the persistent threads have no interaction with Bunraku. Considering that ragdolls normally allow enemies to contact the threads multiple times, I really wish Bunraku had the same behavior, as it would make the two abilities feel much more intertwined. Speaking of Bunraku, I have another minor thing to complain about. Komei has access to several decrees that trigger when she lands a melee finisher, but nothing in her kit actually opens enemies to finishers. Bunraku does have an interesting quirk here though. It preserves the enemy's finisher state. This means that, if an enemy was stunned by something like a slide kick, they'll remain finisher eligible while caught in Bunraku. Problem is, this goes both ways, meaning that enemies who weren't finisher eligible before entering Bunraku cannot be made finisher eligible while they are caught in Bunraku. Honestly, if this ability opened enemies to ground finishers, it would work so much better. Ember's fourth ability, Inferno, inflicts enemies with a unique status effect on hit. In addition to its heat proc, this unique effect shrouds enemies in a swirl of heat damage. The flaming ring grows to 8 meters in size, dealing 700 heat damage per second with a 10% heat status chance. Even more interesting than that, enemies who come into contact with this ring will gain a fire cloak of their own. This means that, when grouped up, enemies will take damage from their own fire cloak and the fire cloaks of nearby enemies. This is a pretty cool mechanic, or it would be if Ember had a grouping ability in her kit to use it. I find it so odd that DE gave her this unique effect that's extremely reliant on grouping, and then just didn't give her a way to leverage it. Real talk, they should make Fireball spawn a tiny sun that pulls in enemies, as that would make this element of Inferno much more useful. Oh, also, the growth of the fire ring scales inversely with duration, meaning that higher ability duration makes the ring grow slower. Why, dude? Just why? Varuna's fourth ability, Ulfrin's Descent, causes Varuna to enter puppy mode and leap to enemies targeted by her crosshair. On hit, Varuna deals 5,000 damage to the target, alongside a guaranteed slash proc. On top of that, enemies within 10 meters of the target are staggered and receive 2,000 slash damage per second for 4 seconds. Ulfrin's Descent has 5 charges, and each kill with the ability boosts the stats of subsequent attacks. In particular, they grant 200% more damage, 5% more critical chance, and 0.1 more critical multiplier, up to a cap of 900% more damage, 45% more crit chance, and 0.45 more crit multiplier. Now, that's all well and good, but there's a major caveat to consider. For some reason, enemies have to be killed by the direct hit of the ability to grant these buffs. If the enemy dies to the slash proc or the slash damage aura, they do not grant the bonus damage, crit chance, or crit multiplier. This is especially frustrating because the slash proc deals the bulk of the ability's damage, being 1,750 damage per second for 6 seconds, for a total of 10,500 damage, and it also ignores armor. So enemies take most of the ability's damage from the slash zone and slash proc, but they don't grant the damage buff if they actually die to them? Why? This quirk makes Ulfrin's Descent a chore to build up, and if you're not using the Ulfrin's Endurance augment, this ability is borderline useless. I really think this should be changed to allow the slash proc and aura to grant the bonus damage if they kill the initial target. This would make the ability a lot less annoying to build up, especially against armored factions. Okay, I know a lot of people are going to get mad at me for this one, but I have to talk some shit about Gulfagor. For those who don't know, this is one of Uriel's demons, and it serves an incredibly important role. Every 4 seconds, Gulfagor will latch onto a nearby enemy's face, staggering them and dealing damage for 10 seconds. If the enemy dies while Gulfagor is latched, they have a 300% chance to drop a health orb and a 100% chance to drop an energy orb, scaling with strength. On top of that, an anti-Sea Bear circle will spawn below the slain enemy, lasting for 10 seconds and spanning a 4-meter radius. Enemies within this circle take 500 heat damage with a guaranteed heat proc every half second, and this is doubled for Sea Bears. I made that up, that's not a thing. The real benefit of Gulfagor, though, is its orb generation, as effects like Equilibrium can make Gulfagor easily carry Uriel's energy economy. But Gulfagor has one weird quirk that makes this difficult at times. For some reason, he prioritizes Eximus units. This means that, not only does he prioritize latching to enemies he can't even stun, but he also latches onto the tankiest enemy he can. Considering that Gulfagor's orbs only spawn when the latched enemy dies, this can make orbs much harder to obtain if he's making out with the beefiest thing he could find. Alright, that's all I wanted to say for this video. Well, that's not entirely true. I had this whole thing about DR scaling I wanted to talk about, but this shit was never gonna get done if I included it. I want to reiterate that I'm not saying the game is poorly balanced as a whole, that the developers are stupid, or anything like that. I just thought all of this stuff was really weird from a design perspective, and I wanted to talk about it. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments section down below, and let me know of any other strange balancing decisions that leave you scratching your head. Beyond that, feel free to like if you enjoyed the video, dislike if you think I'm bizarrely balanced, and subscribe for more garbage every now and again. I also want to give a huge thank you to my channel members who helped to make this video possible. With that said, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.